80 human skulls, buried together at the gate of a 4,000-year-old city in northern China. No written record, no names, just bone. For decades, archaeologists looked at those bones and made an assumption about who these people were. That assumption just got proven wrong by DNA. After a 13-year investigation, nobody outside the field was watching closely. And that single correction turns out to be the smallest part of a much bigger story, because the same research just quietly rewrote how scientists think an entire early Chinese state came together in the first place. Stay with me, because this one starts with buried skulls and ends up reshaping 5,000 years of assumptions. The site is called Shimao, a massive stone-walled settlement in Shanxi province, dated to roughly 4,200 to 3,700 years ago. It covers around 4 square kilometers, making it one of the largest and most important late Neolithic sites ever discovered in China. Archaeologists have known about Shimao's scale for years, its layered stone walls, its jade, and carvings embedded directly into the masonry. Its clear division into separate functional zones, suggesting a stratified, organized society long before most textbooks assumed complex states existed in this part of the world. The site predates the classic Bronze Age dynasties most people associate with early China by centuries, sitting instead right at the tail end of the Neolithic, a period usually imagined as small farming villages rather than walled cities with distinct elite quarters and dedicated ritual spaces. What archaeologists did not have until now was a way to actually read the biological relationships of the people who lived and died there. That gap just closed, and the way it closed is worth pausing on before we even get to the results themselves, because the process alone tells you something about how far this field has come. A team led by Professor Qiaomei Fu at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, working with the Shanxi Provincial Academy of Archaeology, spent 13 years conducting large-scale, high-resolution nuclear DNA analysis on remains from Shimao and nearby sites in southern Shanxi. In total, the team sequenced 169 ancient genomes, narrowed down to 144 unrelated individuals, published this year in the journal Nature. That's not a quick side project. That's more than a decade of careful, painstaking lab work aimed at answering questions. Archaeology alone could never fully settle on its own, spanning multiple institutions, dozens of individual burial contexts, and a level of sample preparation that ancient DNA labs typically measure in years rather than months, precisely because contamination and degradation make this kind of work agonizingly slow to get right. To understand why this matters so much, you first need to understand what ancient DNA actually lets scientists do that bones and pottery never could. Imagine trying to reconstruct a family's reunion photo using nothing but torn scraps recovered from a dozen different old albums with no captions and no dates. Looking at faces alone, you could maybe guess who looks similar to whom, but if you can match the actual torn edges of the paper itself, where one fragment's rip lines up perfectly with another. Fragments rip, you can reconstruct exactly who was standing next to whom, going back generations, with a level of certainty no amount of squinting at faces could ever provide. Ancient DNA works the same way. Shared segments of genetic code are the torn edges. When they match precisely between 2 skeletons, researchers aren't guessing about a family relationship anymore. They're reading it directly out of the evidence. The longer and more specific a shared segment is, the closer the relationship, which is exactly how geneticists can tell the difference between a parent and child, a pair of siblings, or a great-grandparent several steps removed, all without a single written record to confirm any of it. It's a method that works just as well on a 4,000-year-old skeleton as it does on a modern paternity test, which is exactly why it's become such a powerful tool for archaeologists working sites that predate writing entirely. Using exactly that method, Fu's team reconstructed family pedigrees at Shimao, stretching across as many as 4 generations. An extraordinary feat for remains this old. What they found reshapes how researchers think power actually worked. Inside this early society, the genetic data shows a clear pattern of patrilineal descent, meaning status and ancestry were traced specifically through fathers, combined with patrilocal residence, meaning women typically moved to live with their husband's family rather than the other way around. That's not something archaeologists could confidently determine just from grave goods or tumu, layout before. It's the first direct genetic evidence anywhere in early Chinese archaeology, showing exactly how inheritance and authority likely passed down inside a Neolithic state this complex. Researchers involved in the project describe this as opening an entirely new line of inquiry, one that lets scientists actually investigate how ruling families were structured, who counted as part of the elite bloodline, and how different social classes formed and hardened over time, questions that pottery styles and tomb architecture alone could only ever gesture toward rather than answer directly, no matter how carefully archaeologists studied the layout of a burial or the quality of its grave goods. If you're the kind of person who finds 13 years of careful lab work finally cracking a 4,000-year-old mystery genuinely satisfying, go ahead and drop a like on this one. It genuinely helps this channel reach more curious people. Now here's where the story connects back to those 80 skulls. Before the late Shang period centuries later, no other archaeological site in China had produced a collection of human skulls anywhere near this size, all recovered near Shimao's East Gate. Archaeologists had puzzled over this collection for years. Since the sheer scale of it, dozens of skulls concentrated in one location, pointed toward something far more organized than isolated, scattered violence. For years, based on skeletal analysis alone, researchers working from bone morphology had suggested that most of the sacrificial victims found at the site were likely female. That assumption shaped how archaeologists interpreted the entire ritual system at Shimao, including theories about which groups within the society were considered expendable during large-scale ceremonies tied to the settlement's East Gate. And it fed into broader academic debates about gender, status, and vulnerability in early Chinese ritual practice. The genetic evidence overturned that assumption directly. When Fu's team actually sequenced the DNA from those East Gate burials, they found 9 out of 10 individuals examined were male, almost the exact reverse of what earlier morphological assessments had suggested. And the pattern wasn't random or evenly spread across the site either. Male sacrificial victims were heavily concentrated specifically near the East Gate, while female sacrificial remains turned up instead in elite cemetery areas, including sites called Huangchengtai and Hanjiagadan. That separation is a meaningful finding on its own, suggesting that Shimao's ritual practices weren't one uniform system of sacrifice, but a carefully organized set of distinct ceremonies with different roles and different locations depending on the purpose of the ritual being performed. It also suggests a level of ritual planning and social organization that goes well beyond how early sacrificial practice is often imagined, less like chaotic, opportunistic violence, and more like a deliberately structured system with specific rules about who was sacrificed where and why. To be fully clear about what this research does and doesn't claim, nobody is suggesting these findings explain every ritual practiced at Shimao, or that every question about who was selected for sacrifice and why has now been answered. What the genetic data does confirm is that a specific, previously accepted interpretation, built entirely on bone morphology, was measurably wrong on a key detail, and that correction alone is a significant example of how directly ancient DNA can now check archaeology's older assumptions against hard genetic evidence rather than educated guesswork. The bigger rewrite, though, goes well beyond the East Gate. Researchers compared Shimao's genomes against previously published ancient DNA from populations across China, and the results showed that most of Shimao's inhabitants descended from local people who had already been living in that same region roughly 1,000 years earlier, tied specifically to the Yangshao culture, a major Neolithic civilization that spread across the Loess Plateau near the Yellow River. That part actually confirms long-term local continuity, contradicting any idea that Shimao's population arrived suddenly from somewhere else entirely. But continuity was never the whole picture. The genetic data also revealed close connections to communities associated with the Taosi culture in southern Shaanxi, itself a major rival center of power during roughly the same period, to steppe populations related to a group called Yumen, and to rice farming populations from southern China, hundreds of kilometers away. That combination is exactly what forces a rewrite of the older assumption. For a long time, sites like Shimao were treated largely as isolated regional powers, impressive on their own terms, but sitting somewhat apart from the rest of early Chinese civilization, a striking but ultimately self-contained achievement carved into the northern landscape. The genetic evidence tells a very different story. It shows a settlement plugged directly into a wide, active network stretching across northern farming communities, southern rice-growing regions, and steppe-adjacent populations, all interacting, intermarrying, and exchanging genes centuries before anything resembling a unified Chinese state existed on paper. Early Chinese civilization, according to this evidence, wasn't a single isolated seed, growing quietly in one spot. It was already a convergent zone, pulling in people and influence from multiple directions at once. Think of it less like a single tree with one root system, and more like a river delta, fed by multiple separate tributaries that only look like one unified system, once you're standing far enough downstream to see where they've all merged together. This finding lines up with, and builds directly on, other major ancient DNA work coming out of the same broader research community. A widely cited 2020 study published in the journal Science, involving many of the same researchers, including Professor Fu herself alongside geneticist Melinda Yang, found that northern and southern populations in China had actually been genetically distinct lineages for an extraordinary length of time, diverging from each other roughly 9,500 years ago, long before written history, before the earliest dynasties, before most of what gets taught as the starting point of Chinese civilization. Modern populations across East Asia, that study showed, descend from a blend of these two deeply separated ancestral branches mixing back together over thousands of years. Rather than expanding outward from one single uniform ancestral population, the way older models sometimes assumed. That 2020 study also traced how farming populations from the Yellow River region expanded outward over subsequent millennia, carrying their genes, their crops, and very likely early forms of the language family that eventually gave rise to Sino. Tibetan languages spoken by well over 1 billion people today, the expansion pattern researchers have compared to similar farming-driven language spreads seen in other parts of the ancient world. Other recent genomic work adds even more texture to this picture. Research on communities in the Central Plains during the later Eastern Zhou period, a time of famously fractured competing kingdoms, sometimes called the Warring States era, found that local populations maintained remarkably consistent Yellow River-related ancestry, estimated at around 90% across centuries of major political upheaval, even as archaeological and historical records describe near constant warfare, shifting borders, and rapidly rising and falling states. In other words, the genetics beneath Chinese civilization tell a story of two things. Happening simultaneously that earlier models struggled to hold together at once, deep regional genetic stability in some areas across very long stretches of time, layered directly underneath constant active contact and mixing with distant, genetically distinct populations pulled in from hundreds of kilometers away. Researchers studying this period found this same core population absorbing repeated waves of contact from southern China and Southeast Asia throughout the Eastern Zhou era, without that steady trickle of outside contact ever meaningfully diluting the region's dominant Yellow River ancestry. A genuinely delicate balance between deep-rootedness and constant outside contact that older, simpler models of ancient migration were never really built to capture. If this kind of deep dive into how ancient DNA is quietly rewriting entire civilizations is exactly the kind of content you come here for, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. And honestly, the deeper researchers dig into these early Chinese sites, the more assumptions keep needing correction. There's an important distinction worth making clear here, because it's easy to overstate what a finding like this actually means. None of this research is suggesting that early Chinese civilization was somehow less indigenous, less continuous, or less rooted in the Yellow River region than previously believed. If anything, the opposite is true, and that distinction matters, because headlines about DNA rewriting ancient history can easily get misread as implying a population was somehow replaced, displaced, or imported from elsewhere, when the actual finding here is almost the reverse of that. Shimao's core population is confirmed to be locally descended, tracing back at least 1,000 years within the same broad region. What's being corrected isn't the location or root of the civilization. It's the older assumption that early complex societies in this part of the world developed in relative isolation, cut off from other regional populations until much later in history. The genetic evidence says the opposite was already happening, that contact, mixing, and exchange across huge distances were present from a remarkably early stage, running underneath the surface the entire time. If anything, this correction makes the story of early Chinese state formation more impressive, not less, since it shows a society sophisticated enough to organize complex, distinct ritual systems, maintain multi-generation elite lineages, and stay genetically networked across hundreds of kilometers, all at a point in history most people picture as small, disconnected farming communities scattered across an empty landscape. It's also worth being upfront about the limits of what a study like this can tell us. Fu's team analyzed 144 unrelated individuals, an enormous achievement for ancient DNA work at this resolution, but still a sample drawn from specific burial contexts at specific sites. Not a complete census of everyone who ever lived at Shimao across its several centuries of occupation. Entire neighborhoods, work areas, and ordinary residential burials outside the sampled elite cemeteries and ritual zones remain largely untouched by this particular analysis, meaning plenty of Shimao's population, especially people outside the ruling families and sacrificial contexts, still haven't had their story told through DNA at all. Researchers involved have been careful to frame these findings as a foundation for understanding how power, inheritance, and social structure formed in this particular early state, rather than a final complete account closing the book on Shimao's entire history. What makes this moment particularly significant is the method itself and how quickly it's advancing, just over a decade. Hago, getting reliable nuclear DNA out of remains this old from a hot, dry, heavily degraded archaeological context like northern China, was still an enormous technical challenge, with many samples yielding too little usable genetic material to draw any firm conclusions at all, let alone reconstruct multi-generation family trees. the fact that Fu's team could not only recover usable genomes from over 100 individuals, but reconstruct 4-generation family trees and cross-reference ritual burial patterns against biological sex with this level of confidence reflects just how far ancient DNA sequencing technology has advanced within a single research career. Techniques that used to require an entire genome's worth of careful, expensive reconstruction can now be applied at a scale that lets researchers ask genuinely new questions about social structure, not just ancestry. A decade ago, a project like this one would likely have produced a handful of usable genomes at most, enough to sketch a rough outline of a population's origins, but nowhere near enough to reconstruct actual family trees or detect a statistically meaningful split between male and female burial locations across an entire site. Getting to 144 usable individual genomes from remains this old and this degraded represents a real leap in what ancient DNA labs are now capable of producing. Researchers in this field have made clear that Shimao is very likely just the beginning of this particular rewrite. Other major late Neolithic and early Bronze Age sites across China, including places like Taosi and the sites tied to the later Erlitou culture, are strong candidates for the same kind of large-scale genetic analysis in the years ahead. Each additional site sequenced adds another data point to an increasingly detailed, increasingly connected map of exactly how early Chinese civilization actually came together, not from a single isolated origin point radiating outward the way older models assumed, but from multiple deeply rooted regional populations, gradually converging, mixing, and organizing into the complex, stratified societies that eventually became the foundation for everything that followed. Some researchers in this space have compared the current moment to the early days of ancient DNA, research in Europe roughly a decade ago, when a handful of pioneering studies on sites like Stonehenge and various Bronze Age burial mounds ended up completely reshaping how historians understood European prehistory within just a few years, overturning long-held assumptions about migration, kinship, and social hierarchy that had gone essentially unchallenged for generations. If that pattern holds here, the next decade of Chinese archaeogenetics could end up rewriting far more than just one site's ritual practices. So here's where that leaves the story we started with. 80 skulls at a gate, buried for 4,000 years, were quietly correcting the historical record the entire time, waiting for a technology capable of actually reading what was written into the bones themselves. It took 13 years, 169 genomes, and a research team willing to spend over a decade chasing down family trees buried under a mountain in Shanxi. What they found wasn't just an answer about who those specific 80 people were. It was a genuine correction to how scientists understand the roots of Chinese civilization itself, proof that even a story this old, and this thoroughly studied, still had a piece nobody had actually gotten right until now. And if Shimao alone was enough to force this bigger rewrite, it raises an obvious question that researchers in this field are clearly asking themselves already. How many other assumptions, sitting quietly underneath sites just as old, just as thoroughly excavated, and just as confidently interpreted for decades, are waiting for their own 13-year DNA project to come along and prove them wrong too?